Hello and welcome to today's lecture on exploration and the Pacific Northwest. This is a first lecture of a two-part series talking about exploration of the Pacific Northwest by first European powers and then later the United States of America. Before we get into the content of this lecture, I think it's really important that we frame exploration because the Pacific Northwest is simply one component, one part of a global story of European exploration. And I think it's really helpful to understand that the totality of that story and the complexity of that story so that you can understand where the Pacific Northwest fits within that narrative. I think it's important to understand that because too often in American history, we treat these exploration narratives in isolation. And in doing so, we don't see the larger global trends that are occurring, of which these stories are intimately and explicitly a part of. So let's start with exploration. Point number one I want to make about exploration is the word exploration implies that the lands were unknown. But of course, we know that that's not true, that there were indigenous American Indian groups, indigenous Native American tribes who lived in this region and had for centuries, if not thousands of years, depending on what tribe we're talking about. Right? We know that these lands were continuously occupied for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. And that the tribes that were here that we talked about in the previous unit, the coastal tribes, the plateau tribes, they had occupied this land for centuries, if not millennia. So this land was not unknown to them. It was their ancestral home. It was the land that they had lived on for generation after generation after generation after generation. Exponentially multiply that. It was their home. They knew the land, they knew its resources, and they knew how to live and survive and create societies and cultures and civilizations out of this land. And so the very term exploration, in some ways, marginalizes the indigenous peoples who were here. And I want to make that point right off the bat. That exploration was only exploration in the sense of discovering something new from the European and later the American perspective, because it was unknown to them. But that's not to suggest that this land was a blank slate upon which Europeans and Americans could write whatever narratives and make whatever claims that they want, because that's just historically not accurate. So, with that out of the way, I think it's important that we talk about the exploration movement. One of the things that you have to understand is that European exploration was born out of changing political and economic conditions within Europe itself. Going back to the ancient world, there had been overland trade routes that connected Europe with Asia, Europe with Africa. And those lands were fairly well known, at least conceptually, to people living in Europe. They certainly did not have accurate views of the peoples who occupied those lands. If you've ever read any medieval accounts of what China or India or Africa are like, there are kernels of truth in what contained within narratives that are laughably inaccurate, woefully inaccurate, describing the peoples and civilizations that you find in Africa and in Asia and in the Near East and so on and so forth. But despite the fact that Europeans had no real accurate sense of the peoples that lived in those lands, or even of the lands themselves and their resources and their geography and so on and so forth, they did have a concept of the existence of those lands and that there were people who had histories and experiences rooted in those lands for centuries and millennia. They had a sense of that. And there had been overland trade between these two groups, and it's through that trade that the sense of these places came about. It's also important that you understand that these trading routes were a significant source of luxury products for Europeans. That in Asia in particular, but all sorts of other places, there were items that Europeans desired, but simply were not part of the resources available to Europeans. A lot of it involved spices to make your food taste better or taste different or to preserve your food. Things like, say, cinnamon or cloves or even pepper, right? A whole host of other things. There were other luxury items like silk. Silk is produced primarily, silk is produced from the cocoon of a worm that grows in a mulberry tree that grows in a very specific climate within China. And the secret of silk got smuggled out to other places, and attempts were made to grow it and manufacture it in other places, including, in Italy at one point during the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. But at the end of the day, right, the world's major silk production and the finest silk came from China. And there were other items, but these were luxury items. Luxury items that Europeans wanted, and the only way they could acquire them were through overland trade routes that traveled from China and India west across Central Asia through the Near East to the Mediterranean, and ultimately from the Mediterranean up to European powers. Now, since these were luxury items and it cost a lot to carry them overland, it cost a lot to own them. And the fact of the matter is that relatively few Europeans could afford these items. Largely, it was reserved to royalty and the aristocracy, and even within the aristocracy, like the upper aristocracy. But one of the things that happens is that Europe's economy begins to slowly grow and generate more wealth after the year 1000. I'm not going to talk about the reasons why that is, and it's certainly not an unbroken sort of increase in the economy. There are things like warfare and plague and famine and a whole sorts of other things that will set back the economy of Europe as a whole. And that's not to speak of like the uneven growth of the economy. Some areas in Europe grew faster than others. Some kingdoms, some cities, some territories grew faster than the others. Some didn't really grow at all. It's not evenly distributed across Europe, either geographically east to west or within kingdoms themselves. But overall, the general trajectory is economic growth in Europe. And as there's economic growth in Europe, there is more purchasing power, relatively speaking. And as a consequence, there's more desire for goods from Asia. The goods that come from Asia have to come overland. And as a consequence of that, it allows powerful empires in the Near East in particular to control and monopolize that trade if they want. And by the 1400s, a powerful empire called the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is capitaled in Istanbul, a city that used to be known as Constantinople before the Ottoman Turks conquered it. And the empire's core heartland is largely what is modern-day Turkey, but the empire stretches east into most of what is the modern Middle East today and large portions of North Africa. And as a consequence of that empire in the 1400s, there is a new power that is exploiting this trade in profound and fundamental ways for its own economic benefit. The Ottomans are not wanting to stop trade with Europe. They just want to make sure that they economically benefit from it. And so as a consequence of that, right, the prices for these luxury goods are going up. Now, Europeans are willing to pay it because they want these goods. But what you have are groups of people within individual countries who begin to think, well, what if you could bypass the Ottoman Empire and these other sort of like Middle Eastern or Central Asian land empires? What if you could bypass them and get directly to the source in China to get these goods? And as a consequence, you could bring them back and make enormous profit because you'd be getting the goods cheaper at the source, or at least they think so. And then they could sell it at the same really high inflated rates, but be making a lot more profit that way. And that is what spurs the age of exploration. This is what spurs the first explorers. And I think it's important that you understand this because the first explorers weren't engaging in some sort of like scientific endeavor to try and find new plants, new animals, new undiscovered lands that Europeans hitherto had not known. They weren't driven by some sort of sense of curiosity or search for quest for knowledge or any of those things. They were driven purely by what we might describe as capitalistic concerns, trying to secure important trade routes and lucrative monopolies in the trade of certain goods like spices and silk so they could make a lot of money. I think that's something that fundamentally a lot of people who might be aware of the age of exploration but don't know a lot about it just principally do not understand about it. But that's the origins of the age of exploration. It's the ruthless quest for profit, first by individuals and groups, and later by kingdoms and countries. But profit is a huge part of the motive. Now, later territorial conquest will become part of it. We'll talk about that. But originally, it's profit, it's revenue, it's commerce. That's what they're seeking. The first people to begin to do some of this exploration are the Portuguese. In the early 1400s, the Portuguese begin to explore south from Portugal, and Portugal's on the far western part of the Iberian Peninsula. It's about as far west in Europe as you can go. The British Isles are further west, but on continental Europe, it's far west. And at the far west, right, they're kind of cut off from the Mediterranean trade in these luxury goods. So they begin to explore sort of trade with Africa with the idea of moving further south, rounding Africa, which they have no idea how large it is, hitting the Indian Ocean, which they have some sense that the ocean is there, and then getting to China. And this is in part sponsored by the royal family. There's a very famous member of the royal family called Prince Henry the Navigator in Portuguese history who helps put a lot of financial resources behind this. And by the time of 1492, the Portuguese have really established trading posts all throughout the coastal part of West Africa, and they're getting close to rounding the southern tip of Africa, Cape Horn, and progressing that way. And they've really monopolized this. On a side note, this is not something that is a particular topic for this class. This is the start of the transatlantic slave trade because the Portuguese begin to exploit the slave trade that had existed in African kingdoms and territories. They begin to insert themselves in it and begin to try and figure out a way to exploit it. And they're doing that on the cusp of when there's going to be discoveries in the Americas and lead to a whole new demand for slaves, but a different kind of slavery than existed in Africa. But that's a topic of conversation for like a United States history class or history of Latin America class. Not something we're going to talk about, but just incidentally, that the Portuguese are laying the groundwork for the brutal slave trade that will exist from the 1500s on. So Portugal has really established itself as the trading, the Atlantic / African trading kingdom par excellence in Europe. That then takes us to the next topic we need to talk about, which is the famous date of 1492, which is traditionally considered to be the explosion of the age of exploration. And we all know the date, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? But it is really important to understand the context in which that occurred and how that will have an impact for the Pacific Northwest. So Christopher Columbus sailed for the Spanish kingdoms. We traditionally say Columbus sailed for Spain, but technically in 1492 there was no Spain. There were two major Spanish kingdoms. One was the Kingdom of Castile, and the other was the Kingdom of Aragon. And they were ruled by, Castile was ruled by Isabella, a queen, and Portugal was ruled by Ferdinand. Aragon was ruled by a king named Ferdinand. So Isabella of Castile, Ferdinand of Aragon, they were married. And so even though they governed their kingdoms independently, the monarchs were married, and their grandson, who will become Charles I of Spain and Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, he will inherit both thrones and combine them into Spain. And so for this class, and for most classes where you're talking about exploration, we just kind of call it Spain, but technically they're separate. But most people know that Columbus sailed for the Spanish kingdoms. What most people don't realize is Columbus himself was not Spanish. He was Italian. He was from the Italian city of Genoa, or Genova in Italian. And Genoa is a coastal city in the northwest of Italy. And Genoa was a major trading power in the late medieval, early modern, early Renaissance time period. And so Columbus had vast experience as a navigator and trader, because this Genoa was one of the major cities involved in the Mediterranean trade in these luxury goods that I spoke about earlier. And so what happens is that Columbus has this idea that, if someone could just get to China directly by water, that what would happen is that person could secure a monopoly on these luxury goods and just make the equivalent of millions upon millions of dollars today, right, by having a monopoly on these goods from China. And so Columbus wants to do that. And what Columbus believes is that you can go bypassing these land empires I spoke about earlier. That's how you do it. Now, the Portuguese somewhat believe in this, right? And they've monopolized and are controlling the route through Africa. Columbus knows that he can't use that route without going to the King of Portugal and getting his blessing. Anyone else that Columbus goes to is not going to use that route through Africa without risking war with Portugal. And Portugal and Spain, the Spanish kingdoms and Portugal, are two of the wealthiest, most powerful, if not the most powerful states in Europe. So Portugal is very wealthy and very powerful, and no other kingdom really wants to mess with Portugal unless they have a really good reason militarily. So Columbus can't use that Africa route without the blessing of Portugal and being sponsored by Portugal. And he's not going to be sponsored by Portugal. So what Columbus conceives of is an idea that the Great Western Ocean, the ocean we know as the Atlantic today, he believes it's smaller than a lot of people in his own day conceived of it. That you could sail west and relatively quickly you'd arrive at China. Just to clarify here, Columbus believes that the world is round and smaller than people think of. There's often some misconceptions about Columbus that I'd like to clear up right now. Misconception number one is that in Columbus's day, that medieval people believed the world was flat, and that if you sailed west, you'd fall off the edge of the earth. And Columbus was revolutionary because he believed the world was round. I suspect that this idea evolved because of some children's books that I've become familiar with since becoming a historian that kind of taught this to kids, but it's absolute nonsense. Were there probably people in the medieval world who believed the earth was flat if they thought about it? Well, yes, education levels weren't particularly high in the Middle Ages. But well-educated medieval people, of which there weren't that many, believed the world was round. And they believed the world was round primarily because that was the inherited knowledge they got from the Greeks. And the Greeks had believed the world was round and had written so in their scientific treatises, of which Europeans have access to. And so there's widespread belief that the world is round. So that's not what makes Columbus revolutionary, but Columbus himself believes the world is round. But what makes Columbus a bit unique is that he thinks that the world is smaller than anyone else does, and this great Western Ocean, which we refer to as the Atlantic, that it's not that big, and you could sail across it and reach China really quickly. Now, of course, we know he's wrong, that there's two continents and the world's largest ocean between Europe and China if you go west. But Columbus doesn't know that. So he's trying to sell this business model effectively all across Europe. He's mostly rejected, but the Spanish monarchs, technically it's Isabel of Castile, but the Spanish monarchs themselves decide to sponsor this work. And so Columbus is given the resources to mount an expedition, which he does in 1492. And then, of course, he lands in the Caribbean, in what today is the island of Hispaniola, which is today two countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, but Columbus lands on the Dominican Republic side of things. Now, Columbus himself, when he reaches this land, is confused because he may not have an accurate understanding of China, but he has a relative understanding of what he should see. And he knows China's filled with large cities, with massive architecture. He understands that. And what he discovers is a land filled with indigenous peoples who do not build cities or communities in the way that he's expecting China to. So he realizes right away that he's not reached China, but he doesn't realize that he's nowhere close to China. He thinks he's just like somehow ended up further south or further southwest, and he's ended up in India. And that's why he calls the indigenous inhabitants Indians, and that's why to this day lots of indigenous peoples are still called Indians. It's a misnomer because Columbus thought he'd landed in India, and these must be the people of India, the Indians. Now, Columbus himself will then create a trading post on the island of Hispaniola. He'll claim it in the name of Spain, or the Spanish kingdoms. And then he'll begin trying to find, right, his China itself. He creates his base of operation and begins to look around. And of course, he's never going to find China because he's nowhere near China. But he begins looking for it. And it's pretty clear as he's looking for it, he's a little bit panicked because he's made some promises to the Spanish monarchs in return for their support. So Columbus himself has said, if you support me and give me if you let me monopolize the trading post that we're going to establish in China, then I will secure for you an exclusive monopoly on silk and spices. So Columbus has basically said, if you let me be the person who financially benefits the most from the post itself, make me wealthy effectively, then I will make sure your kingdom has a monopoly on these goods. And through this monopoly, you Spanish monarchs will become the wealthiest monarchs on the planet. And with that wealth, you can do what you will. So that's the arrangement he's made with the Spanish monarchs. He has to deliver that arrangement before he goes back, or at least he believes he does. So he becomes increasingly panicked as he, goes to, as he sails around, he can't find China. So Columbus knows eventually he's got to go back because he doesn't have enough resources and he needs to be able to do further expeditions. But he hasn't secured the monopoly and the trading post that he's promised the Spanish monarchs. So what he does is he basically consoles himself by kidnapping a bunch of indigenous peoples and saying they would make great slaves for the Spanish monarchs. And by the way, there seems to be some gold and silver down here. I don't know where the source is, but there's gold and silver here. And gold and silver are the monetary, that's what European kingdoms use as money. So by finding it, he's increased the wealth of them. So he's found, some stuff here that he thinks will be valuable. And he needs to at least show something to Spanish monarchs. So he goes back to Spain. Spanish monarchs don't appear to be terribly impressed with what he's done, but it's enough to buy him some time. And he'll actually make several more expeditions. But these expeditions are both a failure of his original goal and also reveal to the Spanish kingdoms his gross incompetence as sort of an administrator of the lands that he has claimed for them. We don't need to go into the details of it for this class, but effectively what happens is that Columbus never seems to accept that he's discovered two continents unknown to Europeans. He seems to think he's in Asia somewhere. He's just got to find the right area to get to China. But back in Europe, they begin to really understand that there's something else going on here, even if Columbus doesn't accept it. The other thing is, Columbus is a really bad administrator of these areas that he's in charge of by virtue of his agreement with the Spanish kingdoms. And so eventually by 1498, he's ousted by the Spaniards. He's, arrested and spends some time in captivity. And Spain takes over directly these areas in the Caribbean that he has established. So that's the Columbus story. But now what we have in Europe are two major kingdoms, the Spanish kingdoms and Portugal, who are now doing exploration. And their neighbors, they share borders, they're on the Iberian Peninsula, so they're very close to one another. And now they're very rich, they're very powerful, now they're claiming land. This is such a key point for you to understand. They're out there claiming land. But this land is already occupied by indigenous peoples. But the European kingdoms don't care. They don't think that indigenous peoples have the right to the lands that they've lived on for centuries and millennia. They don't think they have the right. Europeans can explore it, plant a flag, put up some forts and trading posts, and the land belongs to them, and these people have to learn to be subjects of whatever European crown is in charge of them. And their lands and their resources are now to be exploited by European powers. That's such an important thing for you to understand, that this is the mindset that Europeans bring. In fact, in the 1500s, there will be debates about whether indigenous peoples even qualify as humans and therefore are subject to basic human rights and the laws that exist in European countries. Once again, it's not a conversation we're going to have in this class, but I want you to be aware it exists. There's this very, very famous debate between a church figure named Bartolomé de las Casas and a Spanish noble named Sepúlveda, and they debate in front of Charles I whether or not indigenous peoples, quote unquote Indians, should be treated with basic human rights under Spanish law. It is a horrible, dehumanizing, degrading way of conceiving of indigenous peoples that ultimately then makes it easier to rationalize their mistreatment. And that's not even counting the diseases that Europeans are bringing to them, even at this point, which are having devastating genocidal effects on them. But you can already see the terms of what's going to happen. And this is centuries before we're talking about exploration in the Pacific Northwest. Now, in terms of European material and physical claims on this land, something important happens after Columbus's first expedition. It's very clear to people back in Europe there's a bunch of new territory that's out there to be claimed. And Portugal is very active in Africa. And the thing you have to understand, and you can take a course in sort of medieval and early modern European history if you want to know more details about this, but suffice to say, the 15th century in Europe is quite volatile. And the 16th century is perhaps even more volatile. In fact, I would argue it is more volatile. So the 1400s and the 1500s, they're periods in which Europe is going to experience is undergoing and will continue to experience some major revolutions and reformations. It's really, really important what's happening in Western Europe. And one of the things that's happening in Europe is, religiously speaking, the Catholic Church is finding itself marginalized. And in 1493 and 94, the only kind of Christianity that exists in Western and Central Europe is Catholicism. So to be a Christian in Western and Central Europe in 1492, 1493, 1494 is to be a member of the Catholic Church. And because of that spiritual reality, that religious situation, that makes the head of the Catholic Church, the popes, incredibly important figures, not just spiritually, but politically. Because in an age of faith, in which theology is often used to invoke monarchy and aristocracy and social inequality and social hierarchies, and that kind of conceptual world, if you have spiritual power, that can be translated into political power. That's foreign to us in our modern world, because even though we understand that lots of people are religious and they have spiritual beliefs and they certainly impact their political ideas, it's really hard for religious leaders today to really sway people politically in the same way that existed in the 1400s. The reason I'm telling you this is there are seeds of change, and there are groups challenging the Catholic Church politically and religiously in the time of Columbus. And the popes are very concerned about this. All right? The popes are very concerned about this. And so what happens is that the pope's strongest allies in Europe are Portugal and the Spanish kingdoms. They might be rivals against one another, but they're staunch allies of the Catholic Church and of the popes. The popes don't want war between their two strongest allies. So in 1493, they start to try and create negotiations. The Pope tries to create negotiations between Spain and Portugal so they can divide up the world for exploration and colonization without going to war with one another. And what the Pope proposes is a line dividing the world in two. East of the line goes to Portugal, west of the line goes to Spain. Those of you might be saying, well, how the heck does that work on a globe, right? Where, eventually East and West meet at some point, and East and West are relative to one another. I agree, but relatively speaking, that's what the popes were trying to do. Spain and Portugal liked the idea. They didn't like the line that the popes drew, so they sort of kicked the popes out of... The popes created what's called the line of demarcation in 1493. Spain and Portugal don't like the line, so they boot the popes out of the room and then negotiate themselves. In 1494, that results in the Treaty of Tordesillas. Treaty of Tordesillas is a line that they thought was being drawn in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. West of the line, Spain. East of the line, Portugal. Couple things about this. First thing is, west of the line exclusively belonged to Spain. East of the line exclusively belonged to Portugal. Spain and Portugal respect those rights. Now you might be wondering, well, what about the rest of the European kingdoms? Well, this is where the church came in. The church threatened excommunication and interdict on any individual or kingdom that violated this. Excommunication means you're put out of the church. It's a condemnation to hell. If you're excommunicated, you're being sentenced to hell because you're outside the church. If you put a kingdom under interdict, that means you suspend church services in the kingdom. No baptisms, no communions, no burial rites, no marriages, none of that stuff. And in particular, baptism and communion were understood to be essential for salvation, right? If you weren't receiving communion, then your soul was endangered. Babies who weren't baptized went to limbo, a kind of area in hell where they weren't really punished, but they could never go to heaven. And so you can imagine in a kingdom the uproar that would exist if the church suspended church services and sacraments. And the church would then turn in these situations, and this happened during the Middle Ages, that the church used this as a power play. What happened is the church would then say, it's not our fault, it's your king's fault. The king has disobeyed the Pope. The king has sinned. The king has sinned against the Pope and the church and God. If you want things to change the king. This is a way to try and, incite rebellion. And to be honest, it had the potential to work. It had been used in the Middle Ages quite effectively. And so the popes are agreeing to use their spiritual powers to protect the exclusive right to settle these respective areas under the Treaty of Tordesillas. So Spain and Portugal are trying to cut out all other European kingdoms. Now, you might notice on the map that there's a little bit of South America that ends up in Portugal's section. And that's true. No one knew it at the time, but South America extended through the line drawn on the map. And that's why Brazil became a Portuguese colony and not a Spanish colony. And that has cultural and consequences for Brazil even to this day. So, under these terms, everything in North and South America, with the exception of Brazil, belongs to the Spanish. Not to indigenous peoples, but to the Spanish. But then, the Protestant Reformation occurs. Once again, I'm not going to talk about that in this class, but the Protestant Reformation is when when Christians and churches protested, that's the root word of Protestant, the Catholic Church, and they broke away from it. Now, this caused enormous social, political, and military upheaval in Europe in the 1500s. For our story, what this meant is the enforcement mechanism of the Treaty of Tordesillas was no longer in effect because the Pope was no longer had the kind of political clout or power to enforce it. And that meant that Spain, after the 1520s, had to deal with other European explorers and colonists trying to take land that they perceived of as theirs. Initially, that doesn't matter very much because between 1498 and 1533, Spain aggressively expands in North and South America. In particular, they conquer the two great empires of the Americas. First, the Aztec in what is modern-day Mexico, and later the Inca in the Andes Mountains of South America. And in conquering these two empires, Spain became phenomenally wealthy. The wealthiest, most powerful kingdom, not just in Europe, but potentially the planet. I mean, effectively only maybe the Ottomans and the Ming Dynasty in China rivaled them. Certainly they were in the conversation of most powerful, wealthiest kingdoms in the world. And as a consequence of that power and wealth, Spain has the ability, to flex its military might and political might to keep other European powers out of its area that it considers exclusively theirs. But that situation is not going to last for long. Now, we framed the big picture terms of exploration. Now let's start to hone in on the Pacific Northwest. So it would appear the first Spanish explorer, first European to reach this area was a Spanish explorer who reached the Pacific Northwest in 1542 or 43. His name is Bartolomé Ferrelo, and I know some of you who are familiar with the Spanish language, you know by my pronunciation that I've misspelled his name on this slide. And it is true. The E on the end of Bartolome should have an accent on it, but I didn't know how to do that at the time I created these slides. So my apologies for misspelling this name. But Bartolome Farello, in 1542 or 43, seems to have reached the Pacific Northwest. It's hard to tell because Farello was looking for basically new deposits of gold and silver. That was what was driving Spanish desires in the 1500s and the 1600s, is more mineral wealth. So he's looking to see if any of the deposits stretched north. He didn't see indigenous peoples with gold or silver jewelry or objects as he moved north, and he kind of just gave up. Based on his descriptions, we know for sure he made it into the San Francisco Bay, right? It looks very much like he made it to parts of like the border between what is now California, Oregon today, but probably not much further than that. So he was the first European explorer to basically reach this area, right? But Spain doesn't have much interest in this area because, as I said, they're looking for precious metals. That's what they're looking for. That has made them instantly wealthy, and they're looking for any new sources, any new veins of silver and gold. The next explorer, right, to come here was actually a guy named Sir Francis Drake. I hate to call Drake an explorer. He's more of a state-sanctioned pirate. He was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth of England, Elizabeth I. And he kind of was a pirate. He basically made his name by raiding Spanish galleons and stealing their gold and silver and then running away. And that's effectively how he came to the Pacific Northwest. Is he wasn't coming here to explore it per se. From what we can tell of his journals, he basically stole a bunch of stuff from some Spanish ships, and they were chasing him, and so he kind of ran and hid in the Pacific Northwest. So he wasn't here for that long. But you know, his escapades made him really famous in England itself. He got knighted, hence his name, Sir Francis Drake. But he came here. We know that from his journals, but it wasn't necessarily for any kind of trade or territorial claim. What that means is, effectively, for most of the 1500s and the 1600s and into the 1700s, the Pacific Northwest gets ignored. But the political situation in North America and the Caribbean begins to change in the 17th century, in the 1600s. The first thing that happens is by the 1600s, Spain is no longer as powerful and wealthy as it once was. It's certainly powerful and wealthy, but even by the 1600s, a lot of the gold and silver deposits that they had utilized have largely dried up. In addition to that, the political situation on the European continent has changed quite a bit. There's been a lot of warfare that's really depleted Spanish coffers. Spain was part of a larger empire that included some European territories. There's been a split in some of that. Some of it is just different parts of the family inheriting different things. Some of it is areas that break away in the 17th century, like the Netherlands. It's all pretty complicated. I'm not really going to go into it at this moment. It's not that germane to what we're talking about, but just know that Spain has sort of seen its power decrease. And by contrast, other European countries and kingdoms are beginning to poach in the territory due to Spain under the terms of the Treaty of Tordesillas. And once again, I just want to make the point, none of these Europeans believe that indigenous peoples have the right to this land. They will use indigenous peoples for trade, for allies against their enemies, but they have no qualms about betraying indigenous peoples and stealing the land that belongs to them and has been their ancestral homelands. I just really want to make that point very clear as we're talking about this. None of them respect the right of indigenous peoples to this land. So, in 1607, you have the Jamestown colony, the basis of the Virginia colony, right, an English colony. In 1620, you have Plymouth colony. 1630, you have Massachusetts Bay, right? And then you just start going through the dates, and you see the development of English North American colonies. The French are becoming active in what is now Canada and the Great Lakes. The Dutch are creating colonies as well, most famously in Manhattan and what we now think of as New York City. Later that'll be taken over by the English, but it was a Dutch colony first. The French, the British, and the Dutch are actively involved in the Caribbean and carving out territories in the Caribbean. And so Spain is seeing what it conceives of as its area of exclusive rights being violated. Now, Spain tries to use its navy to kick these places out, but Spain doesn't have the resources, the size of navy, or the ability to police all of this. And so it's beginning to happen. And in particular, I think it's really important that we talk about England right now, because England is going to become the major rival for Spain in North America. Certainly the French and the Dutch were factors at certain points, but by the time you get to the 1700s and the mid 1700s, it's England that's becoming the dominant player in North America and then challenging Spain in the rest of the continent. Okay? And this is part of a process by which England is creating an overseas empire from 1600 all the way until the 19th century. In fact, England will still have its empire in places like Africa and Asia clear until the end of World War II. So the British Empire, which is this massive empire with huge political and cultural and economic implications around the world that we still deal with the aftermath of it today. That empire is finding its origins here. It's starting here. It's very important that you understand that this is the time when England is building its empire. One thing you need to understand about England is its interests differ and desires differ from the Spanish. Spanish colonial endeavors were directed by the royal government, and they were very much initially focused on precious metals, and then they were kind of focused on other land-based activities. The English initially outsourced their empire to private companies, right? Think like the Virginia Company or the Massachusetts Bay Organization. These were either companies for profit or institutions created, like the Massachusetts Bay example, were Puritans who are looking to flee religious persecution in England, right? But they were not directly owned or operated by the royal government. The royal government said, okay, you pay the charter fee and we get some tax revenue, and then you're kind of in charge of it. Now eventually, of course, the royal government takes the stuff over, but initially it's kind of outsourced. And as a consequence, right, there's just different interests in the colonization and spread of the English. And in particular, they're interested in commerce. They're particularly interested in commerce and trade. That goal of monopolizing trade in Asia that the Spanish had given up on once they discovered all the precious metals in the New World, the British, or the English, later called the British, right, they will pick that up. And so looking for trade commodities and looking to secure trade routes, and in particular looking to secure the Asia trade route, is something that's very, very important to the English, later the British. And you have to keep that in mind when you're thinking about the Pacific Northwest. So with the growing presence of England, later Britain, and if you're wondering, we call them England until 1707, and then after 1707 we call it Britain. The difference is that England and Scotland were governed by the same monarchs, right, from 1603 on, but they were separate kingdoms with their own governments and parliaments and so on and so forth. And in 1707, you get what's called the Act of Union, and the monarchies and the parliaments are and the governments are sort of just blended together, and we get the Kingdom of Great Britain, which includes England, Wales, and Scotland. So I'll just call them Britain from here on out, and the British from here on out. So with the British expansion in the 1700s and Britain becoming a very powerful European kingdom, more powerful than the Spanish begin to be concerned about what's going on in North America, and they begin to look for ways to claim to really solidify their claims to other parts of North America. And that leads Spain to begin to try and figure out a way to stop British expansion. Okay, stop British expansion in North America. By this point, Spain has large settlements in California, and those settlements are important to Spain. They're important farming and agricultural settlements, particularly like cattle. And so Spain wants to protect California in particular. By the 1770s, Britain has not just the 13 original colonies in North America, but territory in the Caribbean, and they also have control of what is now Canada. By virtue of the French and Indian War, Britain ended up taking French possessions in Canada. So Spain is concerned about this. Now, just so you know, Spain and Britain were allies during the French and Indian War, and that meant that Spain ended up with what is now the Louisiana what will be called the Louisiana Territory later on. It's this territory in west of the Mississippi River, between the Mississippi River, west of the Mississippi River, and east of the Rocky Mountains. So that provides them with a buffer from the North American colonies. But now Spain is worried about expansion west from Canada. So to protect California, Spain begins to try and establish a greater foothold in the Pacific Northwest. And so in the 1770s, a series of Spanish explorers begin to come to the Pacific Northwest to chart and make claims to this area. The first is someone called Juan Perez. Okay, Juan Perez. And Juan Perez comes in 1774, and he explores the coast of what is now Washington and British Columbia and the Queen Charlotte Islands. He also explores Vancouver Island and establishes something called Nootka Village, which is a trading post to trade largely in furs with the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest. This is really about Spain saying we really want to control this area as a buffer from British expansion and to protect California. The next year in 1775, two explorers named Bruno de Heceta and Juan Bodega Cadra will come as well and explore the Washington coastline. They will all, and by the way, when I say explore, what they're doing is they're exploring and they're mapping it. Because in terms of imperial claims, settlements matter. So having trading posts or colonies, that matters for saying you control land. But so do being the first people to map or chart something. So if you map it and chart it, you can say to the other countries, look, we were the first here, we've mapped it and we've charted it, and it belongs to us. As part of this exploration in 1775, they will explore a river that they named the San Roque River. They didn't enter it, but they saw it and noted it was a large river, and they named it the San Roque River. That is today the Columbia River. So they saw the mouth of the Columbia River, but chose not to go up the mouth of the river. They just charted the mouth of it. And then in the 1790s, Manuel Quimper and Francisco Elisa will explore the Puget Sound extensively in the 1790s. So Spain is making a push to solidify its claims to the Pacific Northwest. Now keep in mind that Spain already believes that this belongs to them because the Treaty of Tordesillas gave them the right to all of North America. But the problem, of course, is for centuries now, that's been violated by the British, the French, the Dutch, and others. So they have no choice in their mind but to make a more aggressive push to claim the Pacific Northwest as a buffer to protect California from aggressive British expansion. That's the goal here. By contrast, the British have other interests in the Pacific Northwest, and they begin to come and explore the Pacific Northwest. As I said, the British are interested in trade and commerce. They are interested in trade and commerce, and they're interested in monopolizing the Asia trade. And just for some context here, by the 1770s, the British are aggressively claiming land in India, and they're inserting themselves into the political situation in India. Now, the French are there as well, but the British are going to outmaneuver the French by the end of the 1780s and effectively begin the process of totally colonizing India and Pakistan and Burma, which they will do by the 19th century, but like that process is really underway at this point. The British also are a major player in trade with China, and pretty soon they're going to have a dominant role in trade in China by the mid 19th century. So the British are actively involved in China as well. And this is in addition to their North American territories. So the British have global commercial interests. And so the British are looking to expand those commercial interests. In 1778, James Cook comes to the Pacific Northwest as part of this. Now, Cook is probably the most famous British explorer of all time. He was a member of the British Royal Navy, so he's Captain Cook in the Navy. Ostensibly, what he is doing are scientific explorations. He's exploring the world, right? He comes to the Pacific Northwest, but he's famous for his explorations in the South Pacific, like Australia and a bunch of the Polynesian islands. He was in Hawaii, so he explored Hawaii. So Cook is pretty famous in the annals of British exploration. But it's important to remember he's a member of the British Navy, and his exploration is sponsored by the British government, basically looking for areas Britain might want to claim and colonize. And so Britain comes here, Captain Cook comes here in the service of the British government and begins to explore the Pacific Northwest. His original goal for coming here was something called the Northwest Passage, Something called the Northwest Passage. I want to explain to you a little bit about the Northwest Passage. So if you recall, going back to the beginning of this lecture, Columbus's idea that you could go west to get to China quicker, that the ocean was not as large as Europeans thought. Well, we now know that that is wrong, that that there were two continents on the other side of that ocean, not China. However, despite that being known, there was a belief that maybe there was a water route, all the way through the North American continent that meant that you could go by sea directly through the North American continent, right? And then reach the Pacific Ocean and get to China. And that route would still be more valuable than going around Africa and the Indian Ocean. And this is what is known as the Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage was this believed water route through the North American continent. And in fact, the Northwest Passage was the reason why the Jamestown settlement chose the Chesapeake Bay, is they thought that the opening of the Chesapeake Bay might have been the eastern entrance to the quote-unquote Northwest Passage through the North American continent. So this belief in the Northwest Passage goes back to the early 1600s, even earlier. Explorers have been looking for this. They couldn't find it in the eastern part of the continent. So then the question was, well, maybe the easier thing is to look in the western part of the continent. You could find the exit, if you will, and then work your way back. So that's the first reason Cook came out here, is for once and for all to try and decide if a Northwest Passage existed. When he got here, Cook concluded that it did not exist. He said the Northwest Passage did not exist, at least as a saltwater path. So the idea that there was some sort of ocean or a series of bays or bays connected by straits, whatever it is, like a saltwater path, that was non-existent. Cook concluded that it didn't exist. That didn't mean you couldn't use rivers and connect rivers as a freshwater Northwest Passage. That will be the next kind of goal, is to find the river connections. We'll talk about that in a subsequent lecture. But like Cook concludes that the Northwest Passage just doesn't exist, at least as a sea route. He can't talk about freshwater. He says at least as a sea route, it doesn't exist. And so he says, if that's the basis for why you want the Pacific Northwest, you're out of luck. There is no such thing as a Northwest Passage with respect to that. However, Cook says, look, there's lots of resources here in the Pacific Northwest that might be of value, particularly, and they're known as the 3 Fs: fish, fur, forests. So fish, fur, forests. Why are those important? Well, the North Atlantic on the European side had largely been overfished. And fish was one of the few sources of protein that you could preserve through drying and smoking that you could take from somewhere and then take it to Europe and sell it. And dried fish and smoked fish had traditionally been a staple food in European diets, but now it's harder and harder to get a hold of. Also, if you're going to operate a major trading empire that the British have, you need sources of food for your sailors. And having ample sources of dried fish or fresh fish that you could turn to dried fish would be important for you. Fur-bearing animals had largely been trapped and killed out of Europe. And furs were in high demand, particularly beaver pelts and otter pelts, of which there was an abundance in the Pacific Northwest of these animals. And then forests. Europe had been completely deforested, not completely, but largely deforested by the time that Cook is exploring the Pacific Northwest. In fact, Europe today has more forests than it did in the 1700s due to conservation and reforestation. So there's actually more forest. If you were to go to Europe today, you would see more forest than Cook would have seen traveling across Europe in his own day. And of course, lumber is needed for building ships, for furniture, for housing, for all sorts of things, right? So having access to timber like the Pacific Northwest is important. So Cook says there's no Northwest Passage, at least from a saltwater perspective, but there's resources here that the British Empire might want to claim. Cook's explorations lead directly to an explorer / businessman named John Meares arriving in 1786. Meares is basically a fur trader, and he's the first European fur trader to come out here and say, I want to make a trading post for furs out here that I can then take the furs to China and sell. To his mind, it was better to take the furs to China. We'll talk about this in a subsequent lecture, but the reason they're thinking about taking furs to China is that Europeans have a problem when they go to China, which is what Europeans want to do with anywhere they trade is barter. They want to trade good for good. But Europeans don't have they don't really have goods that the Chinese want. So the Chinese are like, just give us your gold and silver. That creates a trade imbalance that the European kingdoms, none of them want. But the one good, there'll be another good later on, but that's a story for East Asian history. But the one good that they will take are furs. So what John Meares can do is get furs relatively inexpensively from a European perspective in the Pacific Northwest, take it to China, barter those for tea, silk, spices, porcelain, then take that to Europe and sell it for huge profits. So that's what Meares wants to do in 1786. So he arrives, he begins to lay the foundations, he goes to China. He actually will bring Chinese workers out to help build ships later on, and they will become the first people of Chinese heritage to be in the Pacific Northwest. They won't stay, but he does that. So he returns in 1789. It's his return that will have a fundamental transformation of the Pacific Northwest. So as I mentioned why Spain has Nootka Village, Spain has tried to increase presence here. And Spain had been alarmed by growing British interest here. And then They come across John Meares in 1789, establishing a fur trading post, building ships. And they know that that means that the British, if he establishes, other Brits will follow. So they arrest Meares in 1789. They arrest him. Spain says, by right of exploration and by the Treaty of Tordesillas, which gave us exclusive rights to this area, this land belongs to us and you are in violation of those international agreements. Britain is outraged over this. Not that Britain cares about John Meares. It's that Britain cares about its commercial and imperial interests, and Spain has gotten in the way of it. And so Britain protests this. And in 1790, they meet at Nootka Village to hammer out an agreement with respect to the Pacific Northwest. Now, Spain went into this wanting sole control of the Pacific Northwest, but Britain isn't going to give them that. Not going to give them that at all. Okay? And Britain is more powerful than Spain. And the other thing you have to understand is that the French Revolution is exploding on Spain's doorstep, in which the French have rebelled and, overthrown their monarch. And that has caused waves of anxiety among monarchs across Europe. And Spain might need a British alliance in the future if that revolution were to spread from France to Spain. And ultimately, in some form, it does. But that's not a story for this class. So Spain can't afford a conflict with Britain on numerous levels. And so by 1792, right? Well, in 1790, the Nootka Agreement is hammered out. And that Nootka Agreement forces Spain to capitulate and accept Britain has a right to be in the Pacific Northwest. Now, the Nootka Agreement doesn't say the Pacific Northwest belongs to Britain. What it says is that that Britain has the right to be in the Pacific Northwest. That Spain is still going to be there, but Britain has the right to be there as well. And Spain can't do anything to stop it. Spain has conceded on its argument of exclusive rights. They've opened the floodgate to British presence here. In 1792, George Vancouver, pictured here, arrived in the Pacific Northwest to ensure the agreement and to help oversee the British presence in the Pacific Northwest and to continue exploration. This was not George Vancouver's first time in the Pacific Northwest. He'd been part of Cook's original expedition. So that's one reason he was chosen, is he was familiar with the territory. He'd been here before. So he is chosen to oversee this. The Nootka Agreement of 1790 is going to fundamentally transform the political situation in the Pacific Northwest. And keep in mind, as we conclude here, I just want to emphasize that indigenous peoples' rights were not discussed at all in this conversation. Spain and Britain believe they have the right to decide the fate of this territory, not the indigenous peoples. All right, that's your look at the early stages of exploration and how they culminate in the Pacific Northwest. In the next lecture, we'll talk much more about explorers in the Pacific Northwest, and we'll introduce two new countries into the mix here, Russia and the United States. All right, I thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.